Um, what I'm going to talk about today is another testimony. I love testimonies. They say so much, and it seems to be that people love to hear testimonies. I'm running out of testimonies. I've given so many. This will probably be the last one I give. And it's based on the premise that the beginnings of our faith have a starting point. And that starting point is established by the conviction that God is real. There are people who believe in God because they want to believe in God, but they have no real evidence that he is there. Not until they actually embark upon a life of prayer and God begins to answer their prayers do they then recognize, wow, he really is for sure and for certain a being that exists, that loves me, that wants to interact with me, and someday he wants me to see him. That's a pretty major blow, actually, to some people's sense of awareness, and they recognize that I can't live in an imaginary world. I have to live in a world where there's a real God, there's a real world, and there's a real future. So basically, what I want to talk about is when my family was young, we had chosen the world we wanted to live in, and we were happy where we were. And it was a little tiny corner of the universe where we said, just leave us alone. This is where we like to be. Excuse me. And God said, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to take you out of that little corner. I'm going to show you that there's something incredible waiting for you out there. Something so much better than what you have chosen. Oh, please, excuse me. But he had to get our attention. And this sounds funny, but he did it by blowing up a house. Now, we laugh about it right now, but when it happened, it was an extremely and gravely serious matter. So with that, I will move into the sermon. I want to start off today's sermon with a Bible verse we all know well, Romans 8:28. And which one do I point it at? Okay, right there. Good. You'd think I'd know by now where I'm supposed to point this thing. Okay, Romans 8:28 says, and we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them that are called according to his purpose. Now, it doesn't come right out and say that, there's going to be bad things that happen in your life, but we all know that that's basically what it's saying. Things can get pretty hairy, get pretty rough, but if you are a child of the kingdom, then it's going to turn out good. This is just one of God's many promises, and no matter how crazy things get, he's always right there to help us hold it together and forge ahead, knowing that his almighty hand has the wheel. And not we ourselves. So just when things look their bleakest and it seems as if there's no possible solution, he comes out of left field and plays his hand and brings about an incredible solution that would have otherwise probably never happened had it not been for what seemed like an unfortunate chain of events. Okay, now, we've gone ahead of ourselves here somehow. There we are. Okay, good. I'm here today to tell you about one such event where it seemed like the world had been turned upside down, and the end result was incredible for good. There may be a handful of people here today who've heard this sermon before. I delivered it several years ago before Rui Oliveira was the pastor here. And the events I'm going to talk about took place right here in Sault Ste. Marie on the 11th of May, 1966. And if Edna Morningstar was here, she'd recognize this story. She actually remembers when this event happened. For most of you, however, you'll be hearing this story for the first time today. Now, we've all read about miracles as Christ performed them in the scripture. Okay, once again, our slideshow has messed up. So I'm just going to have to go ahead and preach this without the slideshow. And things are all out of order. I don't know why. So, which is too bad because we have some incredible photographs of what took place here. We've all read about miracles as Christ performed them. Well, just shut it down, please. It's all messed up. Okay. It's an incredible thing for a blind man to receive his sight, made even more incredible by the fact that he never could see. He was born blind. Turning water into wine, feeding 5,000 people with a few pieces of fish and bread. And see, that one actually should be there right now, the fish and the bread. No, we're way ahead. No, I don't know what we're going to do with this. So, casting out demons and curing people with leprosy, like we just saw here. All those wonderful things that Jesus did, but sometimes we have a tendency to believe that that was somehow the age of miracles back then, as depicted in the Bible and was in the past, and some even go so far as to declare that once we were in the dark ages, the age of miracles was over. This tends to be one of the teachings of dispensationalism, and we as Adventists are not entirely immune to that suggestion. The reality, of course, is that with the passage of time, Christ's new church on earth began to wander away from teaching truth. And sadly, God could no longer bless that church with miracles, for to do so would make it appear that the false church had the blessing and approval of God, when in fact it did not. Coming forward into the 19th century and the formation of the Adventist church, we read in the spirit of prophecy how E.G. White was both witness and recipient of many miracles. As well, other accounts are given from those early fathers of our church of how miracles were fashioned that brought blessings and joy to many during the formative days of the Seventh-day Adventist church. However, for some reason, we have lost our expectation of those early miracles and seldom place much hope in receiving even a small miracle in response to an urgent prayer. But I'm here to tell you that there probably was no such thing as the age of miracles, and if such a thing ever did exist, it's still ongoing here today as we gather in this church, and always has been. When I was a young student at CUC in Walla Walla, there were many overeager young converts to Adventism who made claims that Jesus appeared to them, or spoke to them, or performed some miracle. Years later, several would make confession to simply getting caught up in the enthusiasm of the new faith and allowing their imaginations to convince them that they had seen and heard such things because they really, really, really wanted to have such an experience, so they manufactured one. But the kind of miracle I'm going to tell you about today, you cannot imagine, or as they say, you can't make this stuff up. It was the spring of 1966. We were pretty much like any other family at that time and at that social level. You may have heard me talk in previous sermons about what kind of people we were back then. Beer and cigarettes were our opiate, with a little Johnny Cash thrown in there to convince everyone that this was really a good way to live. And my folks were no exception. Put in your 40 hours a week, then party on the weekends. At family get-togethers, there was booze and potty mouth. All the worst verbal desecrations that my dad and uncles could come up with was flowing freely as the drinks took effect. My mother was into UFOs and paperback novels and true love magazines, but she and my grandfather were serious believers in a loving God. We believed, our entire family, including my cigarette-smoking, beer-drinking dad, we believed if you were good, your ghost went to heaven, and if not, you went to the other place. But we didn't worry about that because we really believed we were good. But it was a self-righteousness with no room for Jesus' example. a righteousness according to what we thought righteousness was, a righteousness that allowed you to punch the daylights out of anybody you figured deserved it. We never studied the Bible, despite the fact that each of us kids had been given one. We thought that we understood pretty much all that you needed to know and to do in order to get to heaven. And none of us suspected that we'd actually been living in total darkness and falsehood. Likewise, none of us suspected that a major, life-changing event was just about to occur that would take us out of that darkness into a glorious realm of knowledge and truth that I wouldn't trade anything for now. There would be horror, there would be pain, there would be fear, but in the end, many years later, everything would come together to bring us into the kingdom. Just like that verse, all things work for good toward them that love God. And I have to say, though we led that worldly life, we did respect and love God. He knew it, and he brought us out of that. My grandparents, who lived in the town of Wyerton, Ontario, had come up to visit us for a week at our home out on Fish Hatchery Road, just about 15 minutes north of town here. They were scheduled to leave the next day, but before they left, they wanted to visit our cousins in the city, who they hadn't seen for ages. So the plans were made, and my parents and grandparents would leave at 4 p.m. the next day and enjoy dinner and visitation with our cousins at their home on Wellington Street here in the city, between Elgin and Spring Street. There's a row of large block, 2.5-story houses there. There's not as many today as there was then. There were one less. Mom had a babysitter waiting for us when we got home from school that day. We were told that our parents would return shortly after 7 that evening, but 7 came and went, and our folks did not return. Likewise with 8 o'clock, and then 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, and 11 o'clock. There was a cold, sick feeling in the pit of my stomach, and I just knew something really bad had happened. The phone number to my cousin's house just wasn't working for some reason. My older brother tried the number, but the operator just kept saying the number had been disconnected. But how could that be true? Just before my folks left at 4 that afternoon, they called my cousins to let them know they were coming. Finally, at 11 o'clock that evening, the phone rang, and the voice on the other end said, "Turn on your TV," which we did. There on the late news were images of what looked like a war zone. Amid the strewn wreckage of what used to be my cousin's 2.5-story house stood my mother, facing away from the camera. Her hair was a wild mess, and she was covered in dust, debris, and shredded bits of wallpaper. At various points in the newscast, my father and my grandfather appeared. They were just in the background, walking around. They didn't speak. Though we didn't know it at the time, both of them had been responsible for rescuing people that day from the rubble and the flames of what had taken place there. To this day, I'm still very proud of them for that, despite the fact that they've both passed on. So, all right, I'm sure you're curious to know what happened, so let me tell you. At some time in the past, here in the Sioux, an old gas main had been run through the basements of several of those old 2.5-story block houses on the north side of Wellington Street. I don't know if it was for cooking or heating or even for the street lamps back in the days before electricity, but what I do know for certain is that after many years in that damp basement, rust had eaten a small hole in that pressurized gas main. And for weeks, neighbors had been complaining about the foul smell coming from the downstairs of that building. We had just enjoyed a week of pleasant, warm spring weather that May, so the new oil furnace had been off long enough to allow the entire basement and some of the first floor to fill up with gas. It was a big house, and it was a lot of gas. But on that day, May the 11th, the temperature nosedived as a cold northern front moved into the area. Upstairs, someone turned on the furnace, and at precisely 7 p.m. that evening, the new oil furnace struck a spark to ignite the oil, and in so doing, detonated the deadly mixture of gas and air. The city of Sault Ste. Marie was rocked by a blast that hurled debris a quarter mile. My grandmother's purse was found 3 blocks away from where the house had been. Folks down in Sioux, Michigan reported seeing a huge blue fireball rise into the evening sky, followed several seconds later by the ground shaking and a sound like several cannons going off at once. Windows were blown out of all the houses around my cousin's house, and several people needed medical attention for that. There was a huge concrete slab in front of the door of the house across the street. It was about 4 by 8 feet and 8 inches thick. It probably weighed about 5,000 pounds. It was blown right up on its edge by the blast and then slowly fell back down. All 4 brick outer walls were blown off of my cousin's house. The roof was lifted straight up in the air, maybe 12 feet, and then fell right straight back down on the wobbling, weight-bearing walls inside that had somehow survived the blast. Piles of brick and plaster and shattered boards lay in heaps around the teetering ruins of what had been a solid 2.5-story brick building just moments before. The dust settled, and neighbors began to emerge from their homes to find out what had just happened. Now, at this point, I'm going to try to see if I can get some of these images. Okay. Okay, there's one of them. That's the ruins of the house. You can see the house next door to it, and you see the roof is exactly the same as the roof of this house here. There's the intact house, and there's what remains of the house that blew up. Now, just looking at that, would you think that anything would come out of that house alive? Nothing, right? Absolute, total devastation. To their credit, the Sioux police, fire trucks, and ambulances were there in record time. But looking at the wreckage, one of the officers said, "I can't see anyone coming out of that alive." Then someone noticed a little girl wandering around. It was a 3.5-year-old daughter of the young married couple who rented the lower apartment in that building. Then their 2-year-old daughter was found on top of one of those piles of rubble, protected by a mattress, half wrapped around her. She was alarmed and scuffed up, but not seriously injured. The little 3.5-year-old girl had dust and a few cuts and bruises, but not seriously injured. This youngest one, the 2-year-old, had been mysteriously protected from falling debris by a bed mattress. Some say it was completely wrapped around her at one point in time. The policemen and rescue teams scratched their heads and said they'd never seen anything like that before. A blast of that magnitude with such extensive damage should have killed everyone in that building. Some days after this event, the victims of that blast began to give their accounts of what they remembered happening that day, and this is where the miracles began to come to light. At 7 o'clock sharp that evening, it was time to go home. My father rose from his chair in the living room to get the coats from my mother and grandparents. He stepped out of the living room into the hallway that led to the bedroom where the coats were lying. Suddenly, he felt himself being lifted by unseen hands and literally flew feet off the ground at very high speed down the hallway to the bedroom door. At this point, his body did a hard 90-degree turn to the right into the bedroom, then another 90-degree turn to the left, and then down in under the bed. Now, I know that when an explosion takes place, people get thrown, but not in that fashion. And you don't wind up under a bed. Only then did the explosion occur, and he was knocked out by the concussive force of the blast, but he suffered absolutely no injuries. My teenage cousin Sandra was upstairs in her bedroom at the time. As the left side of her room suddenly heaved upward at perhaps a 30-degree angle, all the bedroom furniture came sliding down the floor straight towards her. She screamed in terror, put her hands over her head for protection, but a second later realized she needn't have done so. All the corners of the heavy wooden wardrobes came together and locked in position with each other, creating a little box in which she was perfectly safe from flying glass and debris and falling timbers. A little later, a few items that were on fire fell on her. She got a few burns, but that was all. The greater part of the damage to her, I suppose you could say, was the distress she was in. She had to be sedated. She was in panic. The young married couple downstairs, the Smigelskis, still don't know how their youngest girl ended up on top of that pile of rubble, or how their little 3-year-old came out of that house without so much as a scratch. I believe that angels of God simply removed those sweet, innocent little girls until the devastation was over, then quietly deposited them back at the scene. It'll be interesting to ask them in the hereafter. Mr. Smigelski himself had been sleeping on the couch at the time of the explosion. They found the couch outside on the lawn, and Mr. Smigelski still sleeping on it. He was a little cut up and scuffed and covered in dust and such, but he was fine. Mrs. Smigelski didn't fare quite so well. She'd been cooking supper at the time, and the explosion threw the cooking stove over on top of her and burned her legs severely, as well as her arms. But when they found her, she too was wrapped in a mattress. In all, 3 people were protected by mattresses. Do we see a pattern emerging here? My mother and grandparents had been sitting on the couch with my cousin Vince in the living room. Now, I'm going to try to find a picture here again. No go, eh? Okay, going the wrong way. It's not moving for me. Here we go. There's the one. Okay. My cousin Vince, he was 13 at the time, but, city kids, they like to follow what's going on with the teenage culture, so he grew his hair long. Not too different from that fella right there. And it's interesting how the long hair culture was prevalent in the United States as a part of the protest movement against the war in Vietnam. We in Canada didn't have a war in Vietnam, but we grew our hair long anyway, just to be like young people all over the world. So Vince had long hair. And my grandfather was of a stern Prussian German background. And to him, long hair was nothing but a sign of rebellion, and such people should be held down and shaved publicly. After supper, when they all sat down in the living room, Vince sat beside him. My grandfather, who simply could not refrain from chastising, said to Vince, "What are you, a girl? Is that it? You want to be a girl? Why don't you wear a dress while you're at it?" But after that explosion took place and my grandfather dug himself out of the rubble, and there's just about 4 feet of that rubble lying on top of him, he just went black. He doesn't remember hearing a boom. He just went unconscious, and he woke up and he was confined. He couldn't move. And my grandfather was a very powerful man, so he forced himself out, and there was a good 4 feet of that stuff on top of him. And then he remembered that Vince had been sitting next to him and was still down there under all that rubble, and he needed somehow to be extracted before he died of asphyxiation. And that was the problem my grandfather was experiencing. As he was pushing his way out, he couldn't breathe. The air inside that rubble was just all filled with dust, and when he tried to breathe, it just tore at his throat. So my grandfather went down and into the hole he'd pushed out and shoved his hand into the plaster and rubble, getting pierced with nails and wood splinters. His arm was buried to the shoulder before his hand found the top of Vince's head. Knowing that he didn't have time to dig Vince out before he smothered, my grandfather simply caught hold of Vince's long hair at the back of his head, wrapped his hands around it a couple of times, and then pulled with all his might, and up came Vince, still unconscious, but breathing well. Afterwards, when he regained consciousness, my grandfather tearfully told him, if it hadn't been for that long hair of yours, I never would have been able to save you. And he never again bothered Vince about that long hair. My mother, who was sitting in a chair across the room, had seen that wall of rubble approaching at high speed. She only had just a split second there before she blacked out. Threw her hands in front of her and recalls a feeling of intense pressure as her entire body was squeezed into unconsciousness. My dad, he described the same thing too, incredible pressure. She and my grandmother dug themselves out, but I remember several days afterwards, my mother discovered that the force of the blast had jammed a piece of wallpaper in between the lens and the frame of her glasses. So there was a piece of paper sticking out the front of the glass, worked up through over the lens and sticking out on the eye side of the glasses. And you hear stories about tornadoes jamming pieces of straw into trees. It was the same kind of a thing. Over the next several minutes, everybody slowly found their way out of the wreckage. Coming downstairs was particularly harrowing, as there wasn't much left of the old Victorian staircase that used to be there. When they finally got out and away from danger, they found that the news was there, and all the various rescue teams who were standing incredulous that anything alive had come out of that devastation. For the first few minutes, those rescue teams stood there with their mouths open, not believing what they were seeing. And then someone said, well, guys, get busy. Let's get these people to the hospital. My father's car had been parked out in front of the building. There were 4 huge concrete pillars on the front of that building. They must have weighed 1.5 tons each. And these were all blowing out onto the front lawn, with one landing square on top of my father's car. Scratch one 1962 Chevy. I didn't like it anyway. It had big fins like the Batmobile. So now, second day after the event, the Sault Ste ran the headline story for the second straight day in a row. I got to correct that. That's the first day, I'm sorry. First day after the event, it ran the story. Miracle fashioned as 11 survive. There's the first day headlines, okay? House explodes, 9 hurt. This is an original copy, of course. Several members of my family have over the years retained this newspaper. And on the back you see down here in smaller letters it says, Miracle fashioned. Oh, no, wait, I'm sorry. Here it is right here. Miracle fashion, that's the article right there that you're looking at. Okay. The police, the hospitals, fire department were astounded. They'd never seen anything like that. The place should have been an inferno. When the fire truck arrived, the air hung heavy with the smell of gas. Why it hadn't ignited or remained ignited after the blast is anybody's guess. Perhaps the force of the blast was so strong it blew the flame out, or perhaps the angel just stuck his finger over the hole till it was safe to take it off. Way back in the back of the building, or what was left of the building, fire did begin. My older cousin, she was 43, the floor had heaved up where she was standing and she fell down in, and then the floor came back together again. And it was about that wide apart, and it's a good thing she was a skinny woman because it just held her there like Jaws. And then down below it started to burn, and she had on these new nylon plastic shoes. And the heat was beginning to get pretty intense. The shoes were melting on her feet. And my father went to the police officer, and he says, my cousin's back in there. And the police officer says, there's nobody back in there now, and if they are, they're dead. And my dad said, fine, I'm going to go and rescue her myself. And the policeman ordered him, threatened to arrest him if he pushed past. Well, my dad, you didn't say that to my dad. He didn't stop him. So he went back, and the policeman followed him, and there was Florence, sticking legs going back and forth in the fractured floor. So they got the fireman back there right away, and he turned the hose right on her and peeled all the burnt skin off the bottom of her legs. And but she was rescued. She came out of it alive. Okay, so Headlines read, "Miracle fashioned as 11 survive." Now, wasn't that nice of them to actually give God the credit? It was a different world back then. As the news reporters got the various stories from the blast victims, it became obvious to all that there had to have been some sort of divine intervention, as most other such stories as this typically had grisly endings, but not this story. Miracle fashioned as 11 survived blast. A few months after this life-changing event, my poor father took a nervous breakdown and couldn't work to support the family. For the next year, my brave mother did her best to do what little odd job she could to keep the household afloat. I remember collecting pop bottles to help out. But eventually, the repossessions people came and took our freezer, other items of furniture. We had to sell anything we could to keep the family going, until finally the bank foreclosed and took our house. As if the trauma of the explosion wasn't bad enough, my folks were now evicted, cast out onto the street with 6 kids and a father who couldn't function. There was no choice. My grandparents in the South, the same ones who'd been in the house explosion, opened their doors and took us in until my folks could get back on their feet again. So we left the Sioux, traveled 500 miles south, right at the beginning of the winter, one of the worst times to travel, and my folks started all over again in the town of Wyerton, Ontario. And here it was that both my mother and myself noticed on Sunday afternoons there was this religious TV show on the station, the channel down there, that we'd never seen on the stations up north. There was this guy called George Vandeman, got it, we're good now, who wrote a book. He was always advertising on TV. In fact, there were several. There was Planet in Rebellion, A Day to Remember, and perhaps most significantly, I Met a Miracle. Well, we had met our own miracle. And we were keenly interested in any other miracle stories anybody else might have to tell. So I Met a Miracle was an easy sale for George Vandeman. Over the next year or two, my mother continued to order these books, and knowing how she'd been such a fan of Harlequin romance novels, I never thought too much about these religious books. However, slowly but surely, key issues were being addressed in these books: the state of the dead, the second coming, the true Sabbath. Then she signed up for the Amazing Facts Bible study lessons advertised on the It Is Written show that George Vandeman hosted. As it turned out, these studies were mailed to us from a local Adventist pastor just half an hour away in the city of Owen Sound. And Pastor Paulington, you remember that place? You were pastor there for a few years. My mother would devour the truths taught in these publications, then sit all of us kids down and teach us everything she had just learned. I recall listening with fascination, especially to that part about hell, that it is not eternal. The devil is not in charge. He doesn't prod you with his trident. The devil, in fact, will be one of the individuals suffering in hell. And so it went with every lesson she received until finally she had completed the series. Then this pastor visited our house one day and began a series of slideshow presentations on topics ranging from the prophecies of Daniel and Revelation to the introduction of Ellen G. White and the Spirit of Prophecy. Now, I can't say if the Seventh-day Adventist Church here in the Sioux wouldn't have eventually somehow, my mother, would maybe have discovered it. I can't say how it would have happened. But because we had had that miracle, that set of miracles occur in our lives, my mother was receptive to the Advent message. And we had to move south, that's true, where those programs were on TV. But when she saw them for the first time, she knew there was something special. Nothing gave us such relief as now knowing that God does not torture you eternally in the flames of Hades. The Sabbath just made such good sense, as we had all wondered for years why Sunday was always listed as the first day of the week in the calendar. And I remember having these conversations with my mother years before we ever knew there was such a thing as an Adventist. And Jesus was coming back to make everything better again. Can you imagine what great news that was to a people who believed that this evil world would continue indefinitely with no foreseeable end in sight? That's what we believed back then. Eventually, piecemeal, our entire family would be baptized into the Seventh-day Adventist Church. I'm not saying that they have, all these members of my family have a sound walk with the Lord today. Some have made bad choices over the years, but we were all originally baptized, my grandparents included. And it all hinges on the events that took place back there on May the 11th of 1966, when angels intervened to save unsuspecting, undeserving, sinful human beings in a horrific explosion that should have killed everyone. You see, when you know that angelic hands have saved your dad's or your husband's life, when little girls miraculously appear unscathed, when those same unseen hands protect people with bed mattresses, then only the most willfully blind of people can choose to interpret it as anything other than the hand of God working to protect those he loved before they even knew him. And to eventually remove a family from the skepticism of the secular world, indeed to take that whole family into heaven someday. Living the way we were, we thought we were happy, but we were going nowhere. Now, there's a lot that didn't get put in the newspaper, a lot that couldn't get put in the newspaper because for the reporters it was unbelievable. They didn't put that part in the newspaper about my dad being picked up and moved down the hall. And Dad says it was like lightning. He says he never moved so fast in his life. And he thought he was going to splat against the end wall, and he did that 90-degree turn and then under the bed. You can't put that in the newspaper. People will not print that. Now, after the events of May 11th, 1966, it was easy for our family to believe in a loving God. Because we didn't choose to believe it, we were forced to believe it by what had taken place. And we could only make one logical conclusion, that there was a God, and he was a God of love. My earthly father felt those big hands on him. I was 9 years old at the time, and I know that most young boys that age think their fathers can do anything. But I was old enough to know that my father couldn't fly. But in that building, on that day, he did. We grew up knowing about God, but never expecting that we would ever see the dealings of God directly with our family. We read about miracles and thought, well, that's nice, but we live in a world of modern science, and that seemed good enough for us at that time. You know, they were getting ready to send people to the moon. Computers were coming into existence. Why God chose to save those particular people in that building on that day, I cannot say. No one that I'm aware of had prayed for protection. No one was in the habit of praying at all for anything. We never suspected something was about to happen. We were not devoted people. But we became so. And herein lies the essence of every interaction that God has with human beings. God does not interact with us on the basis of who or what we are right now, but on the basis of what we can become, who we will become. He sees the future, the beginning from the end. He sees the future Brian Hepburn, the future Miles Trowbridge, the future everybody here today. He knows who will respond positively to his intercession, to his actions on their behalf. He knows who will embrace his truth and look forward eagerly to the day when they'll see his face for the first time. God is all about the business of saving souls for eternity. Don't ever say that God has never done anything for you personally. Search your past, search your history, analyze the sequence of events in your life. Even in the face of chaos, my mother could see that God had a plan through all of it for the salvation of our entire family. She wasn't necessarily a woman of uncommon faith, but it was just obvious to her. God took our family, living in a secular world of beer, cigarettes, trashy novels, fighting, swearing, and he didn't care about all that. He didn't say, well, they got to clean up a bit before I'll show them I'm real. If he'd done that, if that was the way he did business, nobody would be saved. My mother used to say that even when we didn't know anything about it, God was waiting for an opportunity to show us that he was real and that he loved us. He loved each member of our family enough to go into a house a split second before it was to be torn apart by horrendous forces and protected everyone. Some got hurt a bit, but no one died or was seriously injured or got crippled. When Jesus performed his miracles 2,000 years ago, he didn't do them only for those who were righteous, those who met the standards for a holy people. He did them for anyone who asked him, whatever their state, whatever their condition at the time, like leprosy, for example. Those who had leprosy were considered to be cursed of God. So he went first to the cursed. Because he looks down the road to what he wants them to be, what you and I are supposed to be, right here on this world below, before he comes. And the first step in beginning that process is to give us a starting point. For my family and I, May the 11th of 1966 was that starting point. It hasn't been easy, and it's not supposed to be for any of us. It's an uphill struggle every minute of every day. And to make it worse for those striving to become what he wants them to be, Satan throws sand in the gears and attempts to divert our focus to other seemingly larger concerns. He does it through other people, marriage to the wrong person, hanging with the wrong crowd. You can bet if God has shown himself to you in some way, if he has done something to make himself real to you, then he has given you a starting point and looks eagerly forward to you moving ahead from there. But Satan knows this as well and targets those who are just starting out on the journey of learning and growing. It's a coward's trick to deliberately sabotage a young, vulnerable candidate for eternity. But learning to sidestep these attacks becomes second nature after a few catastrophic tumbles. And you might think that once you've become a seasoned warrior for Christ, that Satan would get the message and finally let up. Well, Satan eventually does give up and leave you alone. You know that, don't you? But usually you die or Jesus will come. So what I'm saying here? Well, quite simply, if you've made your decision to reach the standard that God has foreseen for you, you can expect opposition in a million forms from the day you made your decision until the day you die. And because God knows this is all part of the great controversy, because it's all part of our training, he says, now I'm going to try to get that text again. No, it's gone now. No, it's gone. Okay. 1 Peter 4:12-2, he says, Beloved, think it not strange concerning the fiery trial that is to try you, as though some strange thing was happening to you. In other words, expect it, but rejoice inasmuch as you are partakers in Christ's suffering, that when his glory shall be revealed, in other words, his second coming, you may be glad with exceeding joy. If you be reproached for the name of Christ, happy are you, for the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. No matter how devastating things turn out to be here on earth, God has a wonderful way of taking the most horrific events here and turning them into the greatest of blessings. And he tells you so. He tells you that this is how he does things. In Romans 8:28, for all things work for good to them that love God. All things, no matter how grievous you might think they are. In the Hepburn family, we refer to that day, May the 11th, 1966, as simply the explosion. In talking with our siblings, we might say something like, a year after the explosion, we moved back down south. Or someone might say, did that happen before or after the explosion? It sort of became a BCDC designation in our family by which we measured the passing of time in our early lives. It was a station, a turning point after which nothing and nobody was ever the same again. The same sort of thing happened to America after the collapse of the World Trade Center, or to the world after COVID. Nothing's ever the same again. I've actually heard people say, was that before COVID? Same kind of thing. So after the explosion, it took years for my family to get back to what felt like a normal life again. In some ways, we never did. But 3 years after the explosion, despite the chaos, despite the trauma, despite the fear and the continual battle for sanity, the first 4 of our family had found their starting points and began their journey in the baptismal pool of the Willowdale Church in Toronto, Ontario. For all of us here at Cornerstone, the same journey continues. Some of us are still searching, trying to find that starting point. And what a great place to search for it, right here in the church, with like-interested brothers and sisters. But for all of us, our journey here will move ahead as it should, as God intended, from glory to glory, perfection to perfection, until he comes or we fall asleep in Jesus. Excuse me. And then once we're in the kingdom, we can enjoy that 1,000 years rest. And what does God have in store for us after that rest? More journeys. Journeys to amaze, journeys to astound and fascinate, journeys to occupy our minds and feed our God-given curiosity. Even then, God sees us as we will be, after we've had thousands of years to learn and grow and enjoy those journeys. Journeys to places and people we have no ability to even imagine right now. But if we want to partake in those journeys there, then we have to finish the one that we're on here right now. But the good news is that this is the only part of the journey with potholes and washouts and rough terrain, narrow, dangerous, high-winding trails in one part, dark and low in others, and sometimes it's hard to tell if you're even still on the road. But once the Lord has taken us past this, it's smooth sailing all the way forevermore. And I hope with all my heart that we all see each other there and enjoy many future journeys together in that bright future. 1 Corinthians 2:9 tells us that eye hath not seen, nor ear heard, neither have entered into the heart of man the things which God has prepared for them that love him. Let us all be comforted and encouraged by these words. Amen. Closing hymn is number 517, My Faith Looks Up to Thee.